Happy anniversary, my love.
Happy anniversary. This is perfect.
To many more.
To us.
I love you.
Excuse me, I'll be right back.
Take your time.
The restaurant was his wife's choice. She had picked it 6 weeks in advance, their 15th anniversary, a reservation at a place they had been trying to get into for years. The kind of dinner that communicated to anyone paying attention that some things were still worth the effort. Thomas Reed had been paying attention all evening. That was the thing he would think about afterward. How present he had been, how genuinely happy to be there, how he had looked across the table at his wife Karen and thought, 15 years and I still like this person. At 8:47, Karen excused herself to the restroom. Thomas picked up his wine. His phone buzzed. He looked down. A message from Karen. He read it. I can't wait to leave him. Just a little longer. He set the wine glass down. He read it again. The restaurant continued around him. Conversations, silverware, the soft music that he had commented on when they sat down. None of it had changed. The table looked exactly the same. He looked at the restroom door. He had approximately 90 seconds before Karen returned. He used them. He took a screenshot. He put his phone face down on the table. He picked up his wine. He arranged his face into the expression he had been wearing when she left. When Karen came back and sat down and smiled at him, he smiled back. And he began, from that moment, the most important 60 days of his professional and personal life. Because the message was the beginning of the story. The story behind the message was something considerably worse. Please like this video. Those likes make such a difference. Hit the button. Subscribe too. It's completely free. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Now let me take you back to what Thomas found. Thomas Reed was 46 years old and ran Reed Industrial Supply, a company his grandfather had started and his father had grown, that Thomas had inherited at 30 and had spent 16 years expanding from a regional operation into a national distribution network with 240 employees. He was not a flashy businessman. He was a methodical one, the kind that earned loyalty from people who had been around long enough to understand the difference between someone who managed for appearance and someone who managed for outcomes. He cared about the company the way you care about something that carries your family's name in the actual sense. His grandfather's name was on the original incorporation. His father had added the word "and Sons" when Thomas and his brother joined, and Thomas had removed "and Sons" from the signage when his brother left the business, but had kept it in the legal name because some things deserved to stay. He had 2 children, a daughter, Lily, who was 14 and had his father's stubbornness and her mother's social intelligence. A son, Jack, who was 11 and who, when Thomas had once let him spend a Saturday in the warehouse, had asked questions for 5 consecutive hours without repeating himself. He loved his children in the specific way of a parent who can see who they are going to be. He had also, tonight, received a text message that his wife had sent to the wrong person. Karen Reed was 43 and had been, in most visible respects, a good partner for 15 years. She was present. She managed the household with the efficiency of someone whose organizational intelligence had never found its proper professional outlet. She was warm with the children and appropriately involved with the company's social calendar, the events that mattered, the relationships that needed maintenance. She had also been involved with Thomas's friend and company advisor, Greg Holloway, for 14 months. The affair was not the worst thing. Thomas would understand this when he dug deeper. The affair was the surface. What was underneath was a plan that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with money. Greg Holloway was 48 and had been Thomas's friend since college, the 23-year friendship that most people have at least one of, the one that felt permanent because it had survived everything so far. Greg was a financial consultant who had, at various points over the years, served informally as an advisor to Reed Industrial Supply, reviewing potential acquisitions, offering perspective on financing, the useful proximity of a trusted friend with relevant expertise. He had been approached 14 months ago by a private equity firm called Westmount Capital Group. They had identified Reed Industrial Supply as an acquisition target. They had also identified Greg as the most efficient path to it. The conversation had been specific. Introduce the firm to Thomas through Greg's credibility. Create conditions that made Thomas receptive to a sale. Ensure the deal moved before Thomas could examine it too carefully. Greg had said yes. What Greg and Karen had subsequently developed between them was not entirely separate from the plan. Karen had her own reasons to want the liquidity that a company sale would produce. Thomas would find all of this. He had 60 days before the deal that Greg had been quietly arranging was scheduled to close. Thomas did not confront Karen that night. Not because he had no reaction, he had a significant one, but because 20 years in business had taught him that the first thing you do when you discover a threat is understand its full shape before you reveal that you see it. He came home from the anniversary dinner, he kissed Karen goodnight, he lay in the dark for 3 hours. In the morning, he called his attorney. Her name was Rebecca Walsh. She had handled Reed Industrial Supply's legal affairs for 9 years and had the specific quality of someone who received alarming information without letting it alter her professional function. He told her about the message. He told her his suspicion that something was happening with the company. He did not yet know what. She said, "Before you do anything visible, I need you to tell me everything that has been unusual in the past 18 months. Anything that seemed minor at the time." He talked for 40 minutes. Rebecca listened. She made notes. At the end, she said the Westmount meeting, 3 months ago, Greg had arranged a coffee meeting between Thomas and a Westmount Capital representative, introduced as a casual conversation about industry trends. Thomas had attended, found it unremarkable, and had not followed up, Rebecca said. Westmount Capital has a specific acquisition playbook. They target family-owned businesses with strong cash flow and undervalued real estate holdings. They acquire, strip the assets, sell the real estate, restructure the operations, and exit within 3 years. She said, "Your company fits every criteria," Thomas said. Greg arranged that meeting. "Yes," she said. "He sat with that." He said, "What do I need to do?" Rebecca said, "2 things. First, I need to understand whether any agreements have been signed or any commitments made in your name that you're not aware of. Second, I need to review the company's ownership structure immediately," she said. "How quickly can you get me access to Greg's involvement in company affairs over the past 18 months? Thomas said, "I'll have it to you by end of day." What Rebecca found over the next 2 weeks required her to bring in a forensic accountant. Greg had used his advisory access, informal, never properly scoped, the casualness of a trusted friend who had been around long enough to have login credentials to things, to share specific company data with Westmount Capital over a period of 12 months. Revenue projections, real estate valuations, client contract terms, information that Westmount would need to structure an acquisition offer, information that Greg had no authorization to share. The forensic accountant called what he found the most comprehensively prepared unauthorized disclosure I've seen outside a formal M&A process. Thomas read the report at his desk on a Friday afternoon. He sat with it for an hour. Then he called Rebecca. He said, "What's the timeline on the deal they're trying to close?" She said, "Based on what your accountant found, they've been moving toward a formal offer presentation. Our best estimate is 60 days, possibly less." Thomas said, "What can we do in 60 days?" Rebecca said, "Quite a lot, actually, if we move now." Please like this video. Hit that button. Subscribe if you haven't. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from right now? Now let me tell you what Thomas built in those 60 days. The family trust took 3 weeks to establish. Not a simple trust, a properly structured, irrevocable family trust designed specifically for multi-generational company ownership, with Thomas as the current trustee and provisions for Lily and Jack as successor trustees when they reached appropriate ages. Once the company's equity was inside the trust, a hostile acquisition became legally impossible without the trustees' consent. Thomas was the trustee. He was not going to consent. Rebecca also filed a formal complaint with the relevant regulatory bodies regarding Greg's unauthorized disclosure of proprietary business information, a complaint that was documented, dated, and complete. The complaint would not be resolved quickly, but it was on the record. In week 4, Thomas met with Westmount Capital directly, not because Rebecca advised it, because he wanted to see the room. He sat across from their acquisition director, a smooth, practiced man named David Chen who had the manner of someone accustomed to closing, and he let the man make his pitch. Westmount's offer was structured around assumptions that Greg's disclosed data had enabled. Thomas listened to the entire presentation. At the end, he said, "I appreciate the detail. I'll be in touch." He was not in touch. David Chen followed up twice. Thomas's assistant responded politely both times that Mr. Reed was reviewing the proposal. He was not reviewing the proposal. He was watching the clock. In week 5, he told Karen he knew, not everything. Not the company plot that was still moving through legal channels, and he needed it there before he disrupted anything personal. He told her about the message. She went still. He said, "I'm not going to have the full conversation tonight. I need you to know that I know, and that I've known for 5 weeks, and that everything I've done in the past 5 weeks has been done with that knowledge." Karen said, "Thomas," he said, "not tonight." She said nothing. He said, "The children don't know anything. That stays true until we've handled this properly." She said, "Okay." He said, "I'll sleep in the guest room." He did. In week 6, the trust structure was complete. Rebecca sent him the final documentation on a Tuesday morning. He signed it. He sat at his desk for a moment after signing and thought about his grandfather, the man who had started this company with a single supply contract and a used truck, who had built the original warehouse by hand alongside 2 employees he had known by name for 30 years. He thought about his father adding and sons to the name. He thought about Lily asking questions at the warehouse that day. He thought about Jack, who was 11 and had asked questions for 5 consecutive hours without repeating himself. He thought about what they were going to build when the time came. Then he went back to work. Thomas called Greg on a Thursday. He said, "I'd like to meet." Greg said, "Of course, everything okay?" Thomas said, "Yes. Just need to go over some company matters." They met at a coffee shop. Thomas arrived first. He had a coffee. He watched Greg come in, this man he had known for 23 years, who had attended his wedding, who had been at his father's funeral, who had sat across from him at holidays for 2 decades. Greg sat down. Thomas slid a folder across the table. Greg looked at it. Thomas said, "That's a summary of what our forensic accountant found. Your access logs, the disclosure timeline, the Westmount connection." Greg looked at the folder and did not open it. He said, Thomas said, "I don't need an explanation. I need you to understand that the complaint has already been filed. The company is in a family trust, and Westmount's acquisition path no longer exists." He paused. "The question of our friendship is a separate matter that I'll deal with in my own time." Greg said, "I was going to." "Greg." Thomas's voice was quiet and entirely final. "Don't." Greg closed his mouth. Thomas stood up. He said, "My attorney will be in contact." He left his coffee and walked out. The divorce was filed 6 weeks later. Karen had retained an attorney the day after the guest room conversation, which Thomas had expected and had prepared for. The family trust meant the company was not a marital asset subject to division. This had been the primary financial objective of Karen's anticipated divorce claim, access to a share of the company's equity. The trust removed it cleanly. Karen's attorney challenged the trust timing, arguing that the establishment of the trust in the weeks following Thomas's discovery of the affair was a deliberate sheltering of marital assets. Rebecca had prepared for this argument. The trust had been structured on the advice of a family business succession specialist, with documentation of the business purpose that predated any divorce proceedings, combined with evidence of Westmount's acquisition attempt, the threat to family ownership that the trust was explicitly designed to prevent. The challenge failed. The divorce settlement reflected what the marital estate actually contained, which was significantly less than Karen had anticipated. Greg's professional situation moved more slowly. The formal complaint took 8 months to process through the relevant regulatory body. During those 8 months, Greg's consulting practice, which depended on the trust of the companies he advised, received the specific quiet damage that happens when word moves through professional networks about someone's conduct. Word moved. At the end of 8 months, the regulatory finding was censure and a 2-year suspension of his advisory credentials. His consulting practice did not survive the suspension. Westmount Capital moved on to other targets. Thomas did not immediately tell the children about the divorce. He had committed to protecting them from the process while it was happening, and he had kept that commitment. He told them together, on a Sunday, in the kitchen. He was honest in the specific way of a parent who believes children deserve truth in forms they can handle. He said their mother and he were separating. He said it was not their fault. He said both parents loved them and that would not change. Lily asked if it was about him or about Mom. He said it's about both of us, but more about decisions that were made that couldn't be undone. She looked at him. She said, "Are you okay?" He said, "I'm going to be." Jack said, "Is the company okay?" Thomas looked at his son. He said, "Yes." "The company is fine." Jack said, "Good." Thomas almost laughed at that, almost. Reed Industrial Supply continued. Thomas restructured the advisory relationships. Proper contracts this time, scoped access, oversight that matched the authority being granted. The informality that Greg had exploited was replaced with systems that Rebecca reviewed annually. The company grew in year 2 after the divorce and year 3 after it, not dramatically, steadily. He hired a chief operating officer in year 3, a woman named Carol Park, who had spent 18 years in supply chain management and who, during her interview, had asked questions that Thomas had not been asked before and had found that he liked answering. Carol was good. The company was better with Carol. The company was better generally than it had been before the anniversary dinner, not because the discovery had been good, because the response to it had been, because Thomas had used the 60 days not to collapse but to build something that would outlast the worst that had been planned for it. Lily turned 18 4 years after the divorce. Thomas took her to the warehouse on her birthday, the main distribution center, the largest of the facilities, the one that her great-grandfather could not have imagined, and that her grandfather had believed was possible. He showed her the systems. He explained the operations. He answered her questions. She had more than Jack had had at 11, which was impressive. At the end of the tour, she stood at the loading bay looking out at the fleet of trucks, each one with the company name on the side in the same font that had been on the original lineage. She said, "Grandpa put in Sons in the name." Thomas said, "Yes." She said, "That's going to need to change." He said, "I've been thinking about that." She said, "Daughters count." He said, "Daughters count." She looked at the trucks. She said, "I want to learn all of it, everything." He said, "Then let's start." Here is the question that I want to leave you with. Thomas never confronted Karen in the moment. He never raised his voice at the dinner table. He never sent an angry message to Greg. He managed 60 days of knowing without showing. Was that strength, or was it its own kind of coldness? And do you think he ever forgave either of them? Not for their sake, but for his own. Drop your answer in the comments. I want the real one. And tell me where you're watching from. Please like this video. Please hit that button. It matters so much. Share it with someone. Subscribe if you haven't. It's free. See you in the next one.